My heart stopped when I found the family album open on the coffee table. My wedding photo, the one I loved most, had been defaced with an inverted cross scratched across my face. It was not the first time. In the last months, 7 pictures of me had shown up marked this way. Always when my little grandchildren were in the house. "Grandma, the man in black says you are bad," Miguel, only 5, said without looking up from his drawing. My daughter-in-law pretended not to hear, but I saw her fingers tighten on her cup. A cold shiver climbed my spine. The evil was not from afar, it had crept in through someone I loved and trusted. I breathed slowly, feeling the weight of the battle that had just begun. They did not know my faith made me stronger than I looked. My name is Teresa Navarro. I say it quietly to myself like a prayer sometimes, as if saying my name grounds me in what I have always been. I am widowed 8 years now, and in those years I have learned how to plant my days around small, steady things. I wake with the light, fold my hands, and speak the same words I have spoken since I was young. The words are a rhythm. The words are an anchor. I make the coffee the same way my mother taught me. The kettle sings. The smell of roast fills the kitchen and settles in the corners. I water the plants on the back porch. I touch the leaves to see if they are soft or dry. Each plant is a small responsibility, a reminder that tending is a kind of prayer. There is a little table in my living room where my Bible rests. A white candle sits beside it. A small picture of the Last Supper hangs above, a quiet witness to my mornings. I light that candle when the day feels heavy and read for 10 minutes. Sometimes I only open the Bible to keep my hands busy. The gestures matter as much as the words. Routine is not boredom to me. Routine is fidelity. Routine is a promise I make each day to the people and the God I love. I go to church 3 times a week. I sit in the same pew and let the incense and the choir carry my heart in simple ways. Faith for me is ordinary. It is the grocery list, the folded towel, the whispered amen. I have always been a harbor for my family. My son Eduardo and his wife Camila live close 10 minutes away. The children are here often. I have cooked for birthdays and scraped knees. I have sat awake with fevered chests and tied shoelaces with trembling fingers. My home has been a place of rest and refuge. That is how I lived for decades. Small changes arrived without fanfare. Camila began to look at me differently when she thought I did not see. She would stand at the doorway a beat too long and then fold her arms as if guarding something invisible. The first times I noticed a gesture, I dismissed it as tiredness. People carry burdens we do not know. Then little things vanished. My silver rosary was one. Another time, the slips of paper with verses I left on the fridge for the children were missing. The blessed salt I kept under the sink gone. Each absence was a small cut that stung in the quiet of the evening. I moved through my rooms with a tenderness I had not had to practice before. "Grandma, Mommy says your prayers are lies," Miguel told me once under the table, his voice wrapped in innocence. He was only 5 and did not understand the gravity of claiming such things. I wanted to smooth his hair and answer with patient truth, but I held my tongue and kept my gaze steady. At night, Gabriella, only 3, began to scream. I would find her thrashing in the dark, calling my name as if I were a lighthouse. She would wake with wide eyes and hands that trembled. I pressed a hand to her small chest and felt a tremor that was not fever but fear. The innocence of those little bodies made the pain sharper. Once, at 3 a.m., a smell came through my house like a warning. It was sharp and bitter sulfur. I opened the windows and found nothing but the chill night and the distant hum of streetlights. The smell clung to the air even after I tried to wash it away. I sat at my table and prayed until dawn. I had a presence then, a heaviness that moved like a shadow along the walls. The floorboards creaked when no one walked on them. The plants in the sunniest corner of my garden began to brown as if the light itself had dimmed for them. I would run my hand over a window and feel cold where it should have been warm. The world shifted in ways I had no language for yet. I remember the first Sunday I heard the priest speak about envy and possession. His voice cut through the routine of hymns and felt like a bell. I sat there and felt something click inside me. The words were not merely about strangers far away. They mapped onto the narrow fissures of my own home. A whisper of understanding came like a dawn. Faith did not teach me to fear. Faith taught me to be watchful and compassionate at once. I would not go about this by shouting accusations. I would not let anger be my weapon. I needed discernment. Discernment takes patience. Discernment takes prayer. I began to prepare in small ways. I returned the things I could find to where they belonged. I set the table with the Bible open and fresh oil beside it. I sealed the windows with a small bead of blessed water. These are simple acts, but they have weight when they are done with intent. I visited Padre Raphael the next week. He is a gentle man and wise in ways that do not announce themselves. I told him what I had noticed: missing items, the children's nightmares, a sense of being observed. He listened as a man who knows the value of silence. "Teresa," he said, holding my hand, "the evil prospers where there are openings. Fear and envy are doors. But remember, you are not alone. You have the Word, and you have your family, even if they do not yet see. Pray, but prepare." His words were both comfort and commission. I left the church with a plan forming in me like a seed. I would not act rashly. I would act with prayer, discernment, and firmness. I would be both gentle and unyielding. I made a small altar in my room, simple and humble. A Bible open to the Psalms, a bowl of water, my silver rosary resting on the edge. Each night I moved the oil in tiny circles on the family photograph, naming each person aloud. The naming is a kind of armor. Naming makes things visible and therefore subject to care. I also began a fast for 3 days. No food, only water and prayer. Hunger sharpened my mind and thinned the noise. The house felt larger in those days, and my prayers sounded clearer. I smoothed the covers, swept every corner, and read aloud passages that felt like a balm. The ritual steadied me. During one of my vigils, kneeling on the rug with the Bible on my lap, an image came to me. Not a voice, not even a clear vision, but a sequence like a finger pointing. A drawer in Eduardo's house, a certain shop in town where strange things are sold, and a man who speaks softly in the ears of women who feel threatened. The image was like a map with parts missing. I did not understand all of it, but I trusted the impression. The next morning Eduardo called. His voice was frayed. "Mom, they are acting strange. Miguel cries all night. Gabriella had a seizure at daycare. The doctor said there is nothing physiological." His words landed like a stone. He asked the question we have all been too proud to ask aloud. "Bring them here," I said without hesitation. "Now." "Camila won't let them," he replied, voice small. "She says I'm being dramatic." "Then bring them anyway," I said, and I felt the authority of a mother in the bones of my voice. It was not bravado. It was responsibility. The path was set. I packed some clothes, a thermos of warm water, the children's favorite blanket. I placed the small red scarf Gabriella loved in a bag. Each object carried an intention. I walked out the door feeling the weight of the coming hours like a tide pulling at my legs. On the drive, I prayed for clarity more than courage. I prayed for Eduardo, for Camila, for the children. I prayed for the house, carried it like a memory. I whispered a prayer as I crossed the threshold. I called the children into the living room and set out the Bible. I put the white candle on the coffee table and lit it with a steady hand. Miguel watched me with that small, wary face of his. He reached for my hand without asking. I placed my hand on the children's foreheads and anointed them with the oil I had brought. I said a blessing in low tones, words that steady the spirit. Miguel's breath slowed. Gabriella's small body loosened as if a tension she did not know she carried was being eased. I spent the next hours making soup, rocking, singing hymns I remembered from the old days. I set out the family album and let Miguel flip through the pages. He pointed to a picture of his father and giggled as if the world were still simple and good. For a little while, there was a peace that felt like a dock in a storm. I also watched. I watched the way Miguel drew with that red pen he liked. I watched the small hesitations in Gabriella's smile. I watched Eduardo move through the rooms as if trying to stitch the fabric of his household back together. I watched the little things where cups were put, which doors were left unlocked. The house spoke in the way it was arranged. A neighbor, Maria, came by in the afternoon with a plate of pastries. She has watched us for years and knows the ways of this block. She lingered and lowered her voice when she spoke of Camila. She started seeing someone, Maria said, eyes down. A man who promises protection. Says he can help with family problems. She goes to his place on Fridays. The words fell like a drop of cold water. My hands went still. The pastries smelled sweet and ordinary. Maria moved back into the sunlight and asked me to pray. I promised I would. I promised with the steadiness of a woman who has learned that promises are actions. That night, I sat by the window and watched the moon lift itself. The house hummed with the small noises of a family kept together for one more day. The children slept. Eduardo dozed in an armchair. I stayed awake and read passages until the room felt saturated with them. I whispered to the empty rooms that I would not let this darkness take root. I repeated that line in different words until the mantra became a wall. I am not alone. I am not alone. I am not broken. A shadow brushed the wall but did not cross the candlelight. I felt the layer of the world shift and then settle again. I closed my eyes and prayed not for the absence of trial but for the strength to meet it with love. The next day would bring a discovery. The next day would bring evidence that turned suspicion into certainty. The next day would require me to name the evil and point it out gently but clearly. I felt the weight of that obligation like a tangible thing in my chest. I rose in the pre-dawn and prepared the house with care. I set out the family album, the Bible, the candle. I washed the children's clothes as if washing could remove more than dirt. The routine felt holy. It was a way of saying that ordinary life must continue despite what lurks beyond our understanding. And as light pushed through the curtains, I understood that peace is not the absence of storm but the insistence on tending the light anyway. The days settled into a new rhythm after that weekend. I made a point of naming every small practice that would hold us. We ate together when we could. We said grace, even when it felt awkward and forced. I taught Miguel a short prayer he could fold into his pocket like a talisman. We read a story before bed and sometimes, when the house was quiet, we hummed hymns under our breath. Routine became our shield as much as our comfort. The washing of dishes, the folding of pajamas, the placement of a toy on the shelf, each act was a tiny act of faith. I told myself these things were not superstitious. They were commitments. They were a thread we would not let snap. Yet the tension lingered like a low note under the melody of the day. Small silences grew at the edge of conversations. Camila's absence felt like a presence. Eduardo answered my questions in short phrases, as if words themselves cost him. I could see the strain in his hands when he made coffee. He has always been steady, the worry hollowed him. A neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, stopped by one afternoon to ask how the children were. She lingered while folding her hands. "People talk," she said without malice. "They say the wrong words to those who are frightened." Her voice trembled only a little. That tremble told me more than her words. We began to notice patterns. The red pen kept appearing in unexpected places. A picture frame would be turned face down for reasons no one offered. A necklace that once hung on a hook would be found on the floor of another room. Little things that do not belong where they are found create a shape of meaning if you look long enough. I kept a small notebook. I wrote the times the children woke, the odd sounds, the missing purse. The simple acts of recording steadied me. The book was plain and unassuming, but it collected evidence like a net holds fish. I did not want to make enemies of my family. I wanted to see what was true. At Sundays, we returned to church when we could. Camila came sometimes, other times she did not. When she did sit in the pew, she was a closed book. I saw her hands folded tight like fists under the hymnals. Once, after Mass, I asked her if she was well. She smiled at me in a way that held a little of past warmth and a larger, colder distance. "You always think you know what is right," she said softly. The words were not a question. They were an accusation folded in hurt. There was more in them than jealousy, though jealousy was there too. It vibrated beneath the surface as one of those human threads that can be tugged until a person unravels. I felt the knife of that remark, not because I needed to be defended, but because I could see the layers of fear beneath it. Fear makes people believe in quick solutions. Fear can be coaxed into taking poison and calling it medicine. There were other small frictions that mirrored the larger struggle. Eduardo and Camila argued once in front of the children about money and time. Camila accused Eduardo of letting his mother interfere. Eduardo, exhausted, retreated into silence. The argument was not the root of our trouble, but it was fertilizer for its small seeds that grow thorny in the dark. "Sometimes love looks like control," I told Eduardo one afternoon, when we stood in the kitchen and the light made him seem older than his years. He listened and did not answer. He wanted to defend his wife and also to protect his children. He wanted to be brave in a storm he did not know how to name. We had another small conflict when a neighbor mentioned seeing Camila near a house on the edge of town where candles burned late. Camila denied going there. She said the neighborhood gossip was cruel. She called the neighbor to scold her. The air between us tightened. These small conflicts multiplied like loose threads on a fabric being tugged in different directions. I kept returning, in my thoughts and my prayers, to the difference between a person and the force that might be using her. A person can be loved and held accountable. A force is what we must bind and cast out. Distinguishing the two is an act of mercy and justice both. At home, I made a point of leaving little notes for the children, verses I tucked into their lunchboxes or under pillows. They would sometimes ask why I wrote those words. I would say simply, "So your heart remembers it is held." The children would smile and pocket the notes. Miguel liked to fold them into paper planes and send them sailing across the couch. Objects became signs. A photograph of Eduardo and me, once displayed mid-shelf, was found turned toward the wall 3 evenings in a row. I placed it upright and watched. The next morning it was face down again. No one admitted to moving it. The photograph, small and smiling, had taken on a significance it did not choose. An ordinary thing had become a symbol, and symbols can be battlegrounds. I began to speak with the children about boundaries in the simplest language I could. You are loved, I would say. No one can make you do it. She watched me as if she were reading a page of a book she had not finished. There was distance in her gaze. After the children were asleep, Eduardo and I sat in the dim kitchen. He wanted to tell me something but stopped when Camila appeared at the doorway. She wiped her hands as if tidying away more than crumbs. For a moment, the three of us were in the same room with a distance that felt almost physical. When Camila left to collect something from her bag, she leaned close to Miguel and whispered something into his ear. He went still and nodded without answering. The movement was small and almost invisible, but my mother's heart registered it like a concerted beat. The red pen rolled from his fingers to the floor. I collected it and saw the tip marked with a clumsy, inverted stroke. A chill moved through me despite the warmth in the room. I held the pen as if it were evidence. Camila returned and sat back down. There was a tightness to her smile that read like a question mark. Her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes glistened with something that might have been tears or might have been the sheen of nerves. The air hummed. I did not speak of the pen. I could see the conflict in Eduardo's chest, the desire to trust, the desire to protect. I could see the little fractures forming. We did our best to keep the evening normal, but beneath the surface each breath felt measured. Each small micro-conflict, Camila's pride, Eduardo's indecision, my steady insistence, wove itself into a net of pressure. That night, after everyone slept, I sat with the family album on my lap and let my fingers move over the pages. I thought of the way a photograph can hold more than an image. A photograph holds memory. Memory holds truth in ways time will not wash away. I placed the album carefully on the table and said a prayer that named the worry without naming the person. The suspicion that had been a dull ache now sharpened into something more defined. I could no longer pretend the frictions were mere domestic spats. There was a pattern. The pattern pointed with a finger that grew more certain by the day. I lay awake and pressed my palms together until the hope in them warmed to me. I asked for guidance and for a way to act that would protect rather than punish, that would heal rather than break. I felt the weight of responsibility like a mantle. The next morning I would look for tangible proof. I would search cupboards, pockets, bags. I would listen for the small things that betray larger truths. I would do this not to expose out of spite but to offer a chance at reprieve to the person being used and to those being harmed. The house smelled of coffee and the bright promise of a day. The children hummed as they dressed. Eduardo moved through the rooms with a determined care. I moved among them, a steady presence, and watched the small motions that tell a story. The suspicion had found its shape. I had to know who was turning the simple love of a home into something that could be bent for darker use. I had to know whether the danger came from outside or had been invited in. The next step would not be gentle, but it would be necessary. The line between person and force had become clear enough that I could no longer look away. The question hung in the air, small and terrible in its plainness: who in my family was being used, and by whom? I did not have the answer yet. But the search had begun. The thing that made the world tilt was small and ordinary at first. A red bag, no bigger than a child's fist, tucked into a zipper pocket. I found it halfway down in Miguel's backpack while folding tiny socks. My hands did not tremble. Not then. I remember the quiet on the porch, the kettle still hissing as if nothing had changed. I remember thinking of 1,000 ordinary things at once: where that bag had come from, why it smelled faintly of rosemary, why a single hair looped around the knot felt like a betrayal. I opened it with the same slow care I used to open letters from people I loved. Inside were scraps that did not belong in any grandmother's home. Brown herbs, tied in a rag with little knots. A bent nail. A folded scrap of paper with my name written across it in a hurried, angry red. The hair in the knot was mine. That realization landed like cold rain. It should not have been possible to own both the scent of coffee and the ghost of a curse in the same afternoon. I held the paper and the hair the way you hold something that is not a thing but a verdict. Miguel padded into the room with the slow, unhurried gait of a child who had been allowed to think nothing of hiding secrets. He flinched when he saw the bag open. His little fingers went to his mouth as if he could swallow truth like candy. "Where did you get this?" I asked, voice steady on the outside and iron in the middle. He looked at me with the kind of fear that does not belong to a child. "He said to hide it, Vovo," he whispered. "She said to hide it in your bed." The kitchen air thinned. It felt impossible to place everything at once: the softness of the afternoon light, the hum of distant traffic, the way the house had always smelled like citrus and old pages. I thought of my rosary on the nightstand, the Bible on my table, the little bowl of blessed salt beneath the sink. All of it like armor that had been gnawed at by an invisible mouth. That night the house became an atlas of small betrayals. A plate that had been on the top shelf was in the bottom cabinet. A hymn book was on the porch. A child's shoe found in the washing machine. Each small movement was a sentence written in hands that were not mine. When Gabriella wandered into the kitchen, her face white and sleepy, I almost dissolved with the urge to smooth her hair and pretend none of it had happened. She had lipstick smudged on her chin. My mouth tasted the memory of my own lipstick later, and the scent was the same as the scrap in the bag. I asked gently, because I am a woman who trusts gentleness first, "Who gave you the lipstick, love?" "The man," she said, clear and small. "The man in black. He sits with mommy and gives us marks." Words like heavy stones dropped into my hands. I did not let them cut me. Instead, I folded my palms around them and prayed silently. I have always believed that names make things mortal. Naming the thing removes its claim to the unknown. Naming the thing brings it into the light. I put the little bag in an old wooden box and locked it. I moved with the deliberate calm of someone gathering tools for a job. I did not throw it away. I did not destroy it in anger. I kept the evidence like a surgeon would keep a sample, because evidence stares back at the maker of it and insists on being understood. That evening Eduardo called. His voice was paper thin. He was always a man of practical speech, and now his words came in short little pieces like splinters. "Mom," he said, "Camila says we are under attack." I heard the wavering that fathers do not like to let show. I heard exhaustion and a private shame. I told him in the simplest terms what I had found and what I had heard from the child's mouth. I did not say his wife's name with accusation. I said it like a mother's breath, soft but unignorable. He drove over with the children because somewhere a man must stand with his small ones even if his legs are wobbly. Camila was not there. The note she left smelled faintly of smoke, the way old letters smell when they have been carried too near lamps. She had left a short message about needing space, and the emptiness where she should have been pressed against my ribs like a demand. I watched Eduardo move through the rooms like someone counting stitches, making sure nothing would unravel while the night came. He placed the little bag on my table and watched me look at it. There was a sadness in his posture that felt like a loss of faith in the household itself. He looked at me with that small, desperate question, "What do we do now?" We did what we had to do in the only way we could. We lay the Bible flat and opened it to Psalms. We placed the family photograph in the center, faces smiling out at us as if nothing could touch the moment caught in silver. We poured a few drops of the blessed oil onto our palms and moved them over the photo in careful circles. "God sees," I said aloud, because faith is a sound. It pushes the dark back a little. "God is our refuge," Eduardo echoed, clumsy and tender. Miguel sat at my feet and picked at his shoelace. He kept glancing up as if measuring whether that light in my voice was enough to keep whatever had been summoned away. Children test the world with their eyes. They ask only the things they must. She fed that hunger with someone else's darkness and then offered the remnants to her children. When Eduardo and I sat at the kitchen table, the morning light like a bandage across the counter, he said with a voice I almost did not recognize, "She said I'm weak. She said you want to take everything from us." It was small things put together. The seed of suspicion had been watered slowly, criticisms of my visits, of bedtime prayers, of the way I folded napkins. Those trifles had become the rope of accusation. I did not answer with accusation. I answered with naming. I told him what the children had said. I showed him the bag and the paper. He listened with a face that weathered in stages: shock, then denial, then a reluctant calculation. He wanted to protect his wife, and he wanted to protect his children. He wanted to be both a bridge and a gate. "Take the kids to your mother," he asked, humbling himself in a way that raw love sometimes does. "No," I said. "Bring them here." There was a tremble in my voice but not in my conviction. I felt a call rise in me like a tide. I had to be both the harbor and the storm breaker. I had to be the place they ran to and the place the darkness could not claim. When they arrived, I watched the ways the house rearranged itself around their small bodies. I watched Miguel draw with that red pen he liked. I watched Gabriela tuck a small paper under her pillow and then deny doing anything when I asked. I watched Eduardo try to put words together and let them fall into silence. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat with the little bag on the table and the Bible open at the Psalms. I read until the words had weight enough to lean me upright. I called on the names I had learned as a child: short, solid words that stand in a storm. I called for discernment. I called for protection. I called for the unmasking of that which hid itself in tenderness and fear. The house sighed around me. The plants on the back porch shuddered though there was no wind. The candle burned steady and true. When I touched the box with the hidden things, it was like touching the wound of my own home. I knew then that the revelation was only the opening of a long road. The bag had names inside it and accusation written in a child's hand. The darkness had a voice and a handler. And the handler had a face I recognized. What happens when the face you love holds the instrument of your undoing? I did not have the answer yet. But I knew I would not act in anger. I would act in prayer, in preparation, in a way that protected the children and sought the soul that had been lost. The next step was clear and heavy. I would go to the place where the work had been done. I would follow the map the Lord had given me in fragments. I would expose the door and, with God, close it. The question that stayed in the air like steam from the kettle was simple and terrible: how do you save someone who is both victim and instrument? I knelt then and said aloud what I always say in the darkest hours: not by my hand alone, Lord. Guide me. The answer felt like a warmth behind the sternum. The world did not change that second. But I felt, for the first time, the shape of a plan. And then, as if the house itself exhaled, a sound came like a footstep at the edge of hearing. Not a child's foot. Not a husband's. Something that paused under the windows and listened. I rose and moved to the window and watched the street, ordinary and lifeless. No one walked. No car came. Still, the sense of being watched persisted. The revelation had teeth, and it was now aware that its secret had been seen. I closed the curtains slowly, as one closes the lid of a coffin or the page of a book. The bag sat between us like a small, terrible altar. I set my hand upon it once more and whispered, "You will not take what belongs to God." The night outside was patient. Inside, my heart kept a steady rhythm, a kind of drumbeat that would carry us into what needed to be done next. There was no triumph in that hour. Only a decision. And the decision was prayer. What I would do next would not be quiet. It would not be private. It would be a calling into the light of everything hidden. And I had to be ready to lose the things I loved to save them. The fight had been revealed. The field of it lay in my own house. Now I had to gather the tools. The nights grew long and certain. Fear pressed on my chest like the slow weight of winter. But fear did not own me. It was a visitor that I had the right to receive and then send away. I learned to listen to the body's small betrayals. My hands shook in the quiet when I first found the bag. My sleep thinned into small shards. My back ached in a place I had not known had stored worry. I counted those things like beads on a string. They were proof I was alive and engaged. Memory became an anchor because memory remembers the pattern of deliverance. I thought of the funerals and the long, lonely months after my husband died. I remembered learning how to fold the days back into small things: bread, prayer, the rhythm of the kettle. I remembered how God had given me patience then, and I trusted He would furnish me again. I would not let myself be consumed by the darkness of accusation. Instead, I gathered the routines that had steadied me for decades. I repurposed them as armor. I lit the white candle every morning and every evening. I read aloud scripture, not because the words needed my voice, but because my voice needed the words. A neighbor brought me tamales one evening and sipped her tea too long before asking the question that everyone in town whispered. "Do you think she will come back to the church?" she asked, hushed. The question wore pity like a shawl. "Only if she wants to find light," I answered, careful. "Prayer opens a door, people must step through." She nodded and placed her hand on mine like someone passing along a small warmth. Outside, the street lamp flickered. Inside, the house felt like a living thing that listened. I kept a vigil that became the work of my days and the watch of my nights. 3 nights of fasting, at first only water, only the Bible, only slow, inward breath. Hunger sharpened me. It thinned the fog of ordinary worries so the extraordinary could be seen more clearly. I would scrub the corners of my house as if cleaning could exile spirits. I sprinkled the blessed water in drawers and cupboards, in the crannies where small things hide. I wrote notes and tucked verses into pockets and lunchboxes. I taught Miguel a single prayer and told him to fold it into his fist like a secret. Practical things, I discovered, were also acts of war. Folding the child's pajamas a certain way became a liturgy. Making the soup slowly, stirring with intention, was a kind of exorcism of the ordinary. These small acts tethered us to the real and to the good. Sleep was a battlefield. I kept the Bible on the nightstand and the candle lit even when I slept fitfully. I rose in the small dark hours to read the Psalms, letting their sharp honesty shape my breath. I would whisper the names of my family as if naming them could make them visible to God's protection. Once, in the thick of one long night, a silhouette entered my room, thin as smoke and wrong as a borrowed voice. It hovered at the foot of my bed like a draft seeking an opening. The pressure crushed the breath from my chest. I did not scream. I had learned that screech only amplifies fear. I began to recite Psalm 23 in the low, steady voice I used to read the prayers of the sick. I felt the syllables gather strength like a woven cord. The silhouette recoiled as if the words were a bright blade. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow, I breathed. I will fear no evil. The thing that weighed on my chest loosened as if the sound had been salt in its wound. It did not vanish with a showy flourish. It thinned, like smoke being drawn out a window. My prayer worked not because I had a louder voice, but because my voice was aligned with truth. I learned in those nights that authority is not the same as loudness. A word spoken in the right name holds a weight that no fear can mimic. I was not swinging or striking, I was declaring. I called the darkness by its nature, not its human mask. I said, "She is not the evil," I told Eduardo one slow afternoon while Hans worked at the sink and the radio hummed in the background. "She is a woman being used. We have to save the woman." His eyes betrayed his conflict, father and husband and son all at once. He wanted to stand between his wife and the world, but he needed to stand between the world and his children more. We started to keep a small ledger, not in a way of spying, but of care. Times the children woke. Unusual smells. Doors left open. Small rings of red pen ink in the margins of drawings. I wrote them down in a simple spiral notebook. Recording the things made them objective. When fear is named, it shrinks a little. Once, in the dim purple of an evening, I found a picture frame turned face down on the bookshelf. My photo years younger, smiling, was lying on the floor. I stood it upright with a slow, deliberate motion. When I turned back, it was face down again. No one admitted moving it. The house held its secrets like a living thing. I began to watch for patterns the way one watches for weather. Clouds gather before rain. Little things shift before storms. The red pen kept reappearing in odd places. A hymn book would be out of order. A child's shoe placed where no child would place it. These seem like domestic annoyances until you arrange them in sequence. At Mass one Sunday, I kept my hands folded too hard. The priest's sermon about envy sounded like a bell in a fog. He spoke of hands that take without giving, of hearts that hollow out and then offer the emptiness as sacrifice. The words fit my family like a glove. I made the sign of the cross without thinking and felt an answer form in the bones of me. "Where there is light, the shadow cannot hold," I told Miguel later as he colored with a new box of crayons. He looked at me as if I had taught him a secret spell. He tucked a crayon behind his ear like a soldier tucking a talisman into his hat. The nights of prayer and the days of small watchfulness solidified something in me I had always known but had not needed to prove, that there are doorways and thresholds, and some people open them because they are afraid. We live in a world where fear is presented as counsel. I forgave this woman in the small way I could, by choosing action that sought her healing and the safety of the children, not revenge. I prayed for her even when the house seemed heavy with her absence. I asked God to pull the needle of spite from her hand and to replace it with thread of truth. Yet the pain of betrayal sat like grit. I would sometimes wake with my mouth tasting bitterness. Old sorrows, my husband's death, the lonely years of raising my child came back as if they had rehearsal for this. I allowed them their moment and then folded them away beneath the Psalms. In the thick of one sleepless hour, I heard a child's whisper from down the hall. I rose and found Miguel on the couch, hands folded, whispering to himself. He opened his eyes when he saw me and said, "I prayed for Mommy to be safe and for you too, Vovo." The tenderness of that brief confession was a kind of light. It reminded me that the children were not blank slates, they were hearts learning the grammar of sanctuary. They had not yet been made into weapons without knowing it. "Keep your prayer in your pocket," I told him, and he grinned, as if the instruction was a secret pact. "Carry it like a stone and throw it when you need to steady." Words like that became our armor. They were small and humble and true. The nights of watching were not all fear. They were also work. They were a priestly labor of ordinary things that somehow kept a home from unspooling. They were washing the sheets and saying a psalm aloud and putting clean salt in the corners. They were life, stubborn and holy. And beneath the ritual, a plan was forming. The Lord had given me a thread in a dream, an image of a drawer in Eduardo's house, a name of a shop in town, and a man who spoke soft and promised quick safety. I held that map in my prayers, seeking confirmation and the courage to follow it. There was no turning back. The night had been named. The plan had a shape. I lay in bed the morning before I planned to act and whispered the line that had become both shield and promise. God, give me the courage to love correctly. Give me the wisdom to bind what must be bound. The house seemed to listen and then answered in the ordinary way it always did. The kettle sang, the light moved across the floor, the clock ticked on. The world did not feel miraculous. It felt ready. The confrontation would not be an end. It would be a beginning. And in that beginning, I steeled myself not to be consumed by triumph or by blame but to be an instrument of healing if God willed it. I slept for a short while and woke with a sense of the coming day like a held breath. What I did not know was how fierce the human heart could be when it was confronted. What I did know was that fear would not have the final word in my house. I set a plan in motion that was small and exact. I am not a woman of spectacle. I am a woman of steady hands. My weapons were water, words, and an oil that had been blessed by a priest who smelled of old pages and vinegar. First, I prepared the house like one prepares for an altar. I swept every corner until my arms ached. I opened the windows and let the air move like prayer. I sprinkled a circle of blessed salt at thresholds and tucked slips of scripture into the folds of couch cushions and jacket pockets. I made an altar in my room, not ornate, just honest. A photograph of us in a summer of laughter. A Bible open to the Psalms. A small bowl of oil warmed by my hands. A candle that I lit at dusk and did not let go out. There is a discipline to this, a kind of liturgy, that lines up the soul under a hinge of heaven. I prayed for 3 days in a way I had not in years. Fasting taught me how to hear thin things. The quiet stretched until the edges of the world were clearer. In the stillness, images came not as visions so much as pointers. A drawer in Eduardo's house. A shop on the corner where strange things were sold. A man with a voice like velvet. I went to Padre Raphael and told him everything with the simplicity of confession and the complexity of a mother's fear. He listened with hands that did not flinch. He placed his palm on my shoulder and said, "Teresa, you will walk in the light. Do not be afraid to name the darkness. Naming the darkness is never about hatred. It is about clarity." I asked the priest for a few things: advice, a blessing, a small team of prayer. He gave me a schedule of prayers, laid his stole across the family photograph, and said, "We will pray with you. But you will lead." I had allies in careful places. Maria at the bakery gave me an address she had overheard. Mrs. Alvarez told me the hour she'd seen the man leave Camila's building. Small people with ordinary lives had seen ordinary things that when strung together made a map. The first step was reconnaissance that did not feel like betrayal but like stewardship. I went to Eduardo's house under the pretense of borrowing a tool. My hands touched drawers I had touched 1,000 times and now felt like doors to secrets. In the drawer I had seen in my vision, there was a small envelope. The handwriting on the outside was not Camila's careful, tidy hand but a scratchier script like someone hurried. Inside were receipts for purchases at the shop the neighbors had mentioned: candles, dried herbs, a packet wrapped in cloth. I took photographs with my phone. I did not confront anyone. I read the receipts as though reading a ledger of a sickness. The items were ordinary in a grocery sense but charged with meaning in their arrangement. They repointed me to that shop on the edge of town. Going to that shop felt like walking into a story told in whispers. The smell hit me first: incense that had been burning for long minutes, a sweetness like something rotten at its core. Shelves held relics that were both beautiful and small, like toys made to seem adult. The woman behind the counter spoke with a calm that set my teeth on edge. She asked questions that were too soft. She called Camila by name as if it was a routine. I bought nothing. I looked. A jar with the name of my husband on it sat behind glass labeled in a way I had only seen in nightmares. I left with my hands, not by our strength, the priest intoned, but by his name. The man we were really confronting did not appear as a grand demonic figure. He was a human who knew how to speak to the places where fear lives. When Camila arrived at the smoke, she was a woman in rags of shame and bruises of persuasion. She had been coaxed into believing that love could be ensured with rituals. She looked at the ash and at us and then at her hands. "He told me to save us," she said in a voice that could break glass. I did not come to that moment full of triumph. I came full of an ancient tenderness that has no glory in it. I took her hands and held them. They were cold and wet from tears. "This is not your strength," I said. "But we can find the truth again. We must remove what uses you." She crumpled, and in collapsing she did something that took my breath. She spoke with voices she did not own for short, jagged moments. The priest moved and prayed. I placed my palms on her head and whispered psalms like strings pulling the pieces back into place. There were surges, knots of sound and sudden, sharp movements of the house like a body responding to medicine. The windows rattled and the lights dimmed. It was frightening in a way that was not primitive. It was like watching someone break free of a chain. At the center of that storm, Camila found a voice that was hers. She said, "I am sorry." The phrase was smaller than I expected and larger than any other salve. She told us then how the man had come to her at a time when she felt alone and invisible. He had wrapped judgment in comfort and called it salvation. He took their fear and gave back rituals, and in doing so, he made them believe they had power. The process of undoing did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in long, patient stretches of prayer and work. The priest arranged sessions of deliverance-specific, measured prayers that named the force and commanded release. We burned the objects and then mixed the ashes into earth with salt and threw them away from any home. In those dark hours, I held Eduardo when he cried. I forgave him quietly for whatever part he had played in the slow erosion. Forgiveness does not mean erasing the hurt. It means choosing to repair. Camila asked for help. She sobbed and named the man who had used her name to cut a wound in our family. "He said I could protect my family if I gave him pieces of me," she said. I thought I was being clever. I thought I was fighting for us. We all learned something about the way fear sells itself as a solution. We all learned that the best defense sometimes looks like the softest hands. We rebuilt small things first. We sat around the table and ate soup, and someone joked and Miguel laughed. We put the photographs back in place, this time facing the room with small, deliberate gestures. We recited a prayer together and made a ritual of returning, of re-entering normal life like refugees at home. The final sessions of prayer were not triumphant in a Hollywood way. They were quiet, with small signs. The children's fever broke. The nightmares softened. When Gabriella slept, she no longer muttered the same phrases. Miguel drew suns that were intact and colorful. The road to recovery was not a straight line. There were mornings when Camila would wake with shame like a hangover. She took responsibility and made reparation by the slow, steady work of love, showing up, listening, going to counseling. She joined us at Mass and sat in the back, hands folded and small. I forgave her not because she asked it as a transaction, but because I saw the way the darkness had used her. I forgave because mercy is a work larger than me, and because I had been forgiven too, in ways I had not always noticed. We gathered to pray a formal reconciliation. The priest guided us and asked questions that made us all reveal small places of pride and hurt. We said the words out loud that held us together: "We are family, even when we fail." A thin light of afternoon came through the window and struck the photograph of all of us. For a single second, the sun haloed our gathered hands. It was a small miracle, simple and ordinary and therefore true. We planted the ashes of the burned items beneath a fig tree at the edge of our backyard. The tree was old and stubborn, and I thought of it as the heart of our home. The soil accepted the remnants and folded them like a mother hides a child's secrets. Months moved forward. Camila came to church more often. Eduardo began to sleep more. The children painted with thick, reckless strokes as if recovering color in a world that had briefly lost saturation. But there is one thing prayer teaches you that is not often spoken: deliverance remakes the edges of a person. The family that returns is not the exact same one that was attacked. We are altered by the fact of what happened. Scars remain as maps, not as shame. We honored the scars by telling the truth. No dramatics, only that plain accounting of what happened and how it was healed. We taught the children about boundaries and about the danger of promises that sound like love but are control in disguise. We worked with Camila in therapy, not to excise blame but to restore agency. In the last of the sessions, Camila took my hands and said, "You were right. I was so afraid I could not see I was being used." I held her palms and felt the thinness of time between us being torn and mended. I did not gloat. I did not take the moral high ground. I only held her in the way a mother holds a bruised child who is also her daughter. We all learned a lesson the hard way, that the heart can betray itself when fear is dressed as counsel. We learned that the way back is through courage, and sometimes, through the violent tenderness of naming what must be named. I will not say I was unscarred. I will say the house breathed easier. The children laughed without the edge of dread. The red marks on pictures were replaced by stickers full of suns and stars. Small hands made new patterns. Where there had been teeth of darkness, there was now a small garden. It was not the absence of memory. It was the presence of a different kind of work. I returned to my altar and knelt more often, not out of fear but out of gratitude. Gratitude is a kind of clean air. It renews the lung. We had burned things. We had forgiven. We had planted. We continued the slow work of gentleness, which sometimes looks like the most stubborn form of war. And still, sometimes at dusk, when the light moves across the floor and the house settles against the night, I look at the window and listen. I am not triumphant in a way that eradicates caution. I am vigilant. I have learned to keep small lights burning in the corners where fear might try to hide. The battle is not over everywhere in the world. It never is. But the one in my house, this one had been met with a faith that does not shout but acts. That faith had teeth enough to pull the poisonous thing from the heart and hands we loved. We had been wounded and we had been healed. The scars would remain like lines on a map, useful, instructive, honest. They would guide us and warn us of where not to step. For now, the house smelled like soup and lemon. The children drew with crayons that had no red pen marks among them. The candle on my little altar burned steady and true. I sat with my Bible and felt the simple fact of living, washing, praying, knitting days back together was holy work. I had been called to it and had answered. The darkness had left us with lessons and a debt of care. We paid that debt with kindness, boundaries, and the slow rebuilding of trust. We paid it with the clear eye of prayer and with the plain work of the kitchen table. There is still a question that lives at the edge of my days, a question I do not pretend to answer fully. How many doors in other homes are opened by fear masquerading as counsel? I cannot fix every house. I can only tend my own and, when called, stand at the threshold of another and offer a light. I turned the page of the psalm and whispered thanks. The voice that answered within me was not mine alone. It belonged to a quiet company of those who pray in kitchen light and who do not give up on the people they love. We were not perfect. We were faithful. And that made all the difference. They arrived in the late afternoon when the light had the look of old film. The words finished in a sob. "You think you can take them from me?" I stepped forward slowly, the soles of my feet finding the grain of the floor. I did not raise my voice. I placed my hand on the small bag of items I had taken from Miguel's backpack that morning without telling anyone: red cloth, a scrap of paper with my name, a few dried herbs tied with a thin thread. The memory of that scrap, the thread against my fingers, felt like the place where a wound had been stitched. "Camila," I said, and the name came like a tide. "Tell me why you would hide these things." Her hands went to her mouth, and for a moment I watched a battle play across her face. Pride and shame, fear and something that smelled faintly of triumph. She pulled away and then, as if a wire had been cut, she fell to her knees. "They told me you were the source," she cried. "They said the only way to keep Eduardo was to stop you from taking him. They said if I gave them pieces of us they would bind us together." The house seemed to hold its breath. Miguel shivered in his sleep. Gabriela made a small sound and turned her face to me. There was no accusation in my hand when I reached out to touch Camila's hair. There was only a truth that had the weight of prayer. "You were used," I said quietly. "You were given words dressed like salvation." She flinched when I said it. "No," she said, the words small and brittle. "I did it to save them. I did it to save our family." The thing about spiritual coercion is that it begins by being plausible. When fear is clever, it borrows your desires and returns them as commands. Camila told me then how a man had come to her after a night of sleepless rage. He had spoken in low tones. He had said he could help her hold what felt like slipping. He had shown her tokens and said that through ritual she could secure love. He had called me a rival and a threat, and he had promised protection in return for obedience. I did not speak of demons as if they wore horns. I spoke of the way a wound can become a channel. I spoke of justice and mercy like separate hands reaching for the same child. "Who is he?" I asked. She answered with a name that left a bitter taste. It was a name that had lived on the edges of my prayers. "He calls himself a counselor. He wears soft clothes. He listens like a confessor." Eduardo had been watching all this as if from underwater. He held his phone in his hand, the picture of the altar in the room at the back of their house, small dolls with pins, labels in my handwriting. He looked older than his years and at the same time like a man who had not been given time to learn his own courage. "I found it," he said simply. I confronted him. He laughed, said it was for protection. He told Camila she was strong. For a long beat no one moved. The candle flame drew a thin, honest shadow on the ceiling. In that shadow I felt the brittle line between person and force break into sharper view. Camila was both victim and vector. The man who had whispered into her loneliness had been feeding her wounds. The knowledge did not make me triumphant. It made me sorrowful. Sorrow is a clearer lens than fury. It sees the person inside the wound. I turned to Camila and spoke with the firmness of someone who had buried and loved and lost and still kept speaking. "We will not tear you from your shame," I said. "We will hold you through it. But the work that has been done must end." She looked up at me then, not at the accusation but at the offer of hands. Her chest convulsed. "He told me you would take everything," she whispered. "He showed me things. He said I would be reckless. He said I needed him to make me fierce. Who taught him to call himself savior and to make fear sound like counsel?" I asked. The question held the air like a bell. The answer came in her broken breath. "I do not know his real name. He is a presence. He said my pain made me stronger. Presence can be a ghost of your own loneliness, I said. Or it can be a knot of another's greed. I did the only thing that felt required of me then. I placed my palms on Camilla's head and spoke the name of the Lord like a hinge. I did not shout. I declared. It is a different thing. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command whatever binds you to loosen, I said. You are not property of fear. You are beloved. The room answered in small ways. A portrait on the wall tilted an inch as if some weight had eased. Gabriella made a sound that was not a cry, more like a sighing of wind. Miguel's feverless little brow cooled a fraction. But the work was not done. The human heart resists exposure. When the curtains are pulled back, people can shudder and strike out of shame. Camilla did not strike. She begged. Please, she said. Help me. I cannot find my way out of this. He will be angry when he is discovered. He told me he'd punish me if I left. Her eyes were fixed on Eduardo, and I saw in him the tilt between rage and relief. He wanted to punish the man, but he was mourning the wife he had lost to a whisper. He wanted to protect his children, but he had been absent in small ways that had left Camilla vulnerable. This is the human angle of spiritual wounds. Punishment is not the work of our home, I said, and in saying it I felt how hard it was to offer justice that was not revenge. We will seek help. We will name the thing. We will remove it. Will the church help? Eduardo asked. I will call Padre Raphael, I said. He knows how to pray with the firm voice. He knows the rites. But most of the work will be us, our household, returning to its center. A tremor ran through the room at that. Camilla folded into herself like someone retreating from cold. What if people hate me? She whispered. What if no one believes me? Then we will be the ones to believe you when you tell the truth, I replied. You will have to face consequences. You will have to make reparation. But we will not cast you out. There was a silence that carried the weight of a tide pulling back. The man in the corners of our prayers had been named. Being named is the beginning of being undone. After a long moment, Camilla spoke with a voice that had lost artifice. Help me, she said. Please. I cannot stop. The plea hung like a cord. I felt the room tighten with the awareness of risk. Naming the problem did not end its power. It only shifted the battlefield. I moved to the phone with hands that did not tremble. I called the priest and then called for neighbors who might sit with the children. In the kitchen I boiled water and prepared the bowl of salt. I readied the oil and the verses I would voice again and again. As I packed a small bag with the things I needed, my rosary, the blessed oil, the Bible, I felt something like holy resolve settle in my bones. The scene before me was both fragile and alive. The next steps would be both tender and exacting. We had reached the moment where action was required. The choice was not between mercy and justice, it was between silence and speaking. I took Camilla's hand and held it like she was a child across from me. We will begin tonight, I said. We will not allow this shadow to keep its hold. She nodded once, small as a bird. Mia Jude, she said again. Her words closed the scene and opened the next. The battle had shifted from accusation to rescue. The question that remained was not whether the darkness could be named, but whether love could be firm enough to lead a woman back from it. I filled my lungs and said a short prayer for courage. Then I waited for the first sound of the priest's footsteps on our porch. The prayers began that night as if the house were being unmade and remade at once. Padre Raphael arrived with a slow voice and the smell of old books on his cassock. He carried in his hands a small book of rites, a candle the size of a child's forearm, and a bowl for holy water. When he crossed the threshold, he did not swagger. He simply knelt and began to pray. We made a circle in the living room, the children sleeping under blankets that smelled of chamomile and sun. She told us about the first time she went to that man, how her shame had been a doorway he simply walked through. She confessed the small cruelties words said in the dark, the way she had kept secrets and convinced herself it was protection. She did not ask for excuses. She asked for help. There was manifestation, yes. Objects trembled and the light stuttered. For a moment Gabriella sat up mid-cry and spoke with a voice that rolled like a stone. Then the priest commanded silence. I laid my hand on the child's back and said a psalm like a stitch. The crying eased like weather clearing. We did not perform exorcism as a show. We prayed and we watched. We named the lie and then named the truth to replace it. We called on the pattern of goodness the family had known, the small rites that bind. We made them visible again. At night we burned the items and mixed the ashes with salt and buried them under the old fig tree at the edge of our yard. The act felt like burying a part of our memory and then planting something new over it. I dug with my hands and felt the dirt fall into the spaces like a liturgy. I pressed the soil down and whispered the names of my grandchildren into the earth. We also did what mothers and families do, we ate together. We sat around the table and made soup with deliberate hands. Miguel laughed at something Eduardo said, and I watched the sound like a small miracle. Little acts of normalcy can be exorcism too. A child's laugh is a kind of scripture. There were nights when the manifestations were more violent in feeling than in action. Camila would wake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, her hands clawing at the sheets. She would whisper the man's words as if they were the only law she knew. We held her through it. We prayed through it. The priest would lay his hands and say, and slowly her breath would return to the right rhythm. We worked on boundaries as much as on prayers. Camila knew she could not simply return to the life that had been. She agreed to counseling, to church attendance, to telling the truth to friends and family. Eduardo learned to listen in ways he had not before, and to say no when someone, no matter how persuasive, offered a quick fix. Forgiveness was not immediate. It was a scaffold that we built slowly. There were moments when Eduardo's voice trembled with anger, and I held him. There were moments when Camila collapsed at the table and begged me to tell her there was still a place for her. Forgiving did not mean evading the harm. It meant naming it and then walking through the consequences with someone you love. Neighbors whispered. Church members came by with bread and with questions. Some kept their distance. Some offered their hands and their steady presence. I learned then that communities are not just networks, they are altars. They hold one another up or they let one another fall. The man who had claimed to be a counselor was eventually confronted. Eduardo, with a quiet that came from a wound turned into resolve, went to the places he had been seen. He found the back room, the jars, the dolls, the notes. The man denied at first. Then he slipped. When he realized he had been discovered, he became small in a way that made me pity him. We did not beat him with words. We named him instead as a man who preyed on fear. We called the authorities, because spiritual abuse can also be civil wrong. We said that we would not make him into a monster to be feared from afar. We exposed him as what he was, a person who used trust like a currency and bought fear. Camila's recovery was not linear. She had nights of bright shame, mornings of small clarity, afternoons when the old siren would call in her thoughts. But she showed up. She brought soup to neighbors. She accompanied us to Mass and sat in the back and prayed with hands folded. The children, who had been the instruments of a broken promise, became again what they were, children. The priest arranged for weekly sessions of prayer and discernment, but he told me plainly that most of the work would be domestic. He said, "Teresa, the home is the first church. Your hands will do more than your sermons." And so we worked. We cleaned the drawers and set new pictures in frames. We taught the children a single prayer and told them to fold it like a stone and carry it. We created liturgies out of laundry and soup and bedtime stories. Each small act was a stitch in a new garment. The change was not theatrical. It was subtle. Miguel began to sleep through the night without waking terrified. Gabriella's nightmares ceased. Camila began to smile in a way that did not seem forced, small and honest. Eduardo stood straighter. I began to sleep again in the way of someone who trusts the morning. When the final prayer of the liberation sessions was said, it was not a roar so much as a settling, like a house that had been vacated of a draft. The air felt thicker somehow, as if a door had been shut and then bolted. We sat together on the sofa, hands linked, and let the silence do the repairing for a while. We burned the last object together. It was a small bundle of paper with names written on it. When it became ash, I put my palm on Camila's shoulder. "This is not the end of your work," I said. "It is the beginning of your return." She cried then, and those were not the tears of compulsion but the tears of a woman who had been given back her mind. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." "You cannot repay," I answered. "You can only live." We rebuilt, slowly. The pictures were rehung. The children's drawings replaced the crosses. We planted flowers where there had been a pile of ashes. I found myself more stern in ways that were kind. I established new boundaries not as punishments but as fences of protection, phone calls reduced at night, visitors vetted, a new openness about counseling. People asked if I felt victorious. I said no. I said instead that I felt accountable and grateful. Victory felt small next to the work of mending. The wound had left a scar, yes, but it had also taught us the geography of our hearts. The priest told us that what had happened to Camila was a warning that we cannot outsource our humanity. He said, we must be present to one another. The devil loves the absent ear and the unattended grief. On the evening we agreed to a formal reconciliation, we lit the candle and let it burn between us like a witness. Camila came forward and spoke of her shame. Eduardo spoke of his sorrow. The children handed their hands to us as if closing a circle. What rose in that hour was quieter than any triumph. It was a thin light, and it was enough. It warmed the photographs on the wall. It warmed the faces at the table. It warmed me. We would later find that the fig tree, which had taken the ashes, grew new leaves with a stubborn green. Life became small and steady again. There remained a residue of caution in me, a vigilance sharpened like a blade. But that vigilance was not fear. It was a guard shaped by faith. In the weeks that followed we kept to our rituals. We went to Mass, we prayed at the table, we read aloud at night. Camila continued counseling. Eduardo found a quiet humility and a new commitment to presence. The children grew like things that had been repotted and were thriving. We had been given something I had thought only stories spoke of, a second chance. 6 months later, the house spoke a gentler language. The candles on my altar burned steady and without theatrics. The photographs I kept are faced to the room. The children draw suns and stick them to the refrigerator. There is a rhythm to our days that is not naive but deliberate. What I learned is simple and terrible. Evil often comes dressed as help. It offers an answer when the heart is hungry. It speaks in the timbre of compassion and then takes what it can. That is why discernment is not a luxury, it is a guardrail. I do not claim heroics. I claim faith made practical. I prayed, but I also boiled the soup. I interceded, but I also asked for help. Faith without action is a coat left on a peg. Action without prayer is a map without a compass. Forgiveness did not mean erasing the wound. It meant repair.